In our last lecture, we examined the course of liberty in the French Revolution and Napoleon. In these next two lectures, we will examine the Anglo-American tradition of liberty, the liberal tradition, and see its embodiment in Winston Churchill. These three lectures on the French Revolution, on the liberal tradition, and then on Winston Churchill will enable us to compare and contrast the two great ideas of liberty, not only in our own day, but throughout history. Napoleon, like the French Revolution before him, and of which he is the culmination, represents what Lord Acton called the continental idea of freedom, continental liberalism. Churchill is the embodiment of the Anglo-American tradition of freedom. In the continental view, in the French Revolution view, the state is the supreme end, and liberty is an end to state power. The state knows no real limits, and the individual receives his fulfillment of liberty by being part of the state. It is the fulfillment of Rousseau's concept of the general will, which is greater than the majority, greater than the sum of its whole. It is essentially, to continue to quote Lord Acton, a secular concept of freedom. It does not insist that liberty and morality, liberty and religion are bound together. In fact, the French Revolution was essentially an anti-church movement. Napoleon himself was the great free thinker. And the state can impose upon the citizen demands that go beyond the ordinary criteria of morality. The Anglo-American tradition is one rooted in the ideal that liberty is the end in itself, and that the liberty of the individual is more important than the state itself. It is one that says liberty is ultimately a moral obligation. And in the words of George Washington, those who tell you you can have liberty without morality, or morality without religion, are leading you down the road of despotism. So it is this contrast that we wish to examine. And we go back to that remarkably fruitful year that was 1776. It gave us the Declaration of Independence. It gave us Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And it gave us Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. That is one of the most influential works in history. Some people still read Gibbon today. The Declaration of Independence is certainly with us. But Adam Smith may indeed affect us every day, for he is the guiding spirit of economics. Smith was a professor. He taught at the University of Glasgow. And in those days, Glasgow was a great center of learning, certainly in the British Isles, far more significant than Oxford. As Smith pointed out, and Gibbon liked to remind himself, the professors at Oxford received a salary, so they didn't care how they taught. At Glasgow, their salary came from student fees, and so the better they taught, the more money they got. And Smith was a very effective lecturer. He was friends with some of the leading figures in the Scottish Enlightenment, the inventor of the steam engine, James Watt, the chemist Joseph Black, the great historian and philosopher David Hume. And Smith is perhaps the greatest of all of these. His Wealth of Nations was written as a critique of the current view of economics, mercantilism, in which it was the duty of the state to interfere in economics. That is how a state gained power, by regulating the economy, by setting up tariffs, for example, to make sure that the goods produced in its own country were competitive. Smith said this is all wrong. He started out from a very radical concept of freedom. That is, the government should do as little as possible. The government should not regulate the economy. The government should not regulate social life. The government should limit itself to providing a stable constitution, to providing good courts where contracts could be enforced. But for the rest, the individual was the best guide to his own self-interest. And as for economics, As Gibbon believed in laws of history, Smith believed in laws of economics. These were natural laws. They were as much a law as a law of physics. And such laws of the natural economy fostered free trade. Let every nation produce whatever it wants to, trade it without barriers. And by a law of the market, it will find economic success. In fact, laws of the market determined everything. You might almost say from Smith's success as a professor, that the laws of the market will determine what courses are attended. Students will go to those courses that serve their needs. They will not go to those that don't. So all aspects of life, really, are determined by a law of the market. Now, this meant not only free trade, but it also meant no regulation of working hours. If an employer wants his employees to work for 20 hours, then so be it. If they don't like it, they can go somewhere else. But it is for the employer to determine this. Labor unions, they should not exist. Everything should be determined purely on the basis of self-interest. And this view of economics would lead it to be called as the dismal science. Because also, wages. An employer did no good to working men by giving them high wages. They should be paid an absolute subsistence level. Because if you gave them more money, all they would do is have more children who would then eat up any excess that they had and reduce them back to a subsistence level. So for the working man, there really wasn't much hope. But it was wrong to interfere in the natural laws of the market. And this view of the market determining supply and demand is still a fundamental feature of the most influential economic policy of the day. One that has really driven from the marketplace the views of Lord Keynes, that the government should actively interfere in providing social welfare programs and pumping the market. So Adam Smith and this liberal concept of economics is a major feature in the liberal tradition. And it stands in opposition to aspects of the French Revolution developed in the Communist Soviet Union and in the Third Reich, that the state should plan the economics and that the economy should be based on the needs of the state. Not so in the liberal tradition. The second great intellectual milestone in the liberal tradition, in the Anglo-American liberal tradition, is John Stuart Mill and his work on liberty, written in 1859. Mill was an intellectual prodigy. His father, James Mill, was a significant intellectual figure, a close friend and associate of Jeremy Bentham, whose utilitarian philosophy proclaimed the greatest good for the greatest number of citizens, and who was very active in the reform movement in England, and who believed that the Athenian democracy, with its strong emphasis upon individual freedom, was the model of the past. And it was James Mill, whom we quoted very early on in our lectures, who said that the Battle of Marathon was more important for English liberty than the Battle of Hastings. Well, James Mill decided that his son was going to be a model of education. Young John Stuart Mill did not attend Oxford or Cambridge, did not attend one of the famous English public schools, what we would call a private school. Instead, he was educated by his father, under close supervision from Jeremy Bentham. He learned to read Greek by the time he was 3. By the time he was 8, he had a superb knowledge of classical and modern history, and by the time he was 12, he had completed his studies in philosophy and political economy. He was already reading and advising his father on his father's own publications. And Mill became, by the time he published his work on liberty, perhaps the most influential figure in English intellectual life. This enormous study as a youth left its imprint upon him. Not only, as he said, did it put him well beyond his contemporaries in knowledge, but it also led to a series of intellectual and even mental crises as he went through life. His private life was unconventional. He was extremely close and intimate with Mrs. Harriet Taylor, whose husband was alive, and they spent the most astounding amount of time together by the standards of the Victorian age. Their life together was the subject of considerable comment by their friends. From time to time, Mr. Taylor would issue somewhat feeble protest about what everybody was saying. And then finally, after he died, they married. And On Liberty is a joint publication of both John Stuart Mill and his wife, Harriet. His definition of liberty takes us to the very center of this Anglo-American tradition of intellectual liberty. The object of this essay, he wrote, is to assert one simple principle: as entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual in the way of compulsion and control, whether the means used be physical force in the form of legal penalties or the moral coercion of public opinion. That principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because in the opinions of others to do so would be wise or even right. These are good reasons for remonstrating with him, or reasoning with him, or persuading him, or entreating him, but not for compelling him or visiting him with any evil in case he do otherwise. Now, this is the most radical concept of individual freedom. As Adam Smith has said, there is no role for the state in economics. Mill is saying that there is no role for the state in the social improvement of the individual. It is thus a strict departure from Rousseau's view that society should improve the individual. No, Mill says the individual must be left alone. And that is the basic concept of freedom, that the individual should be left alone and not be interfered with. This concept of individual liberty for John Stuart Mill is historically rooted. And he talks about the role of the majority. And shouldn't the majority be able to make laws for the good of the individual? Mankind, he says, can hardly be too often reminded that there was once a man called Socrates, between whom and the legal authorities and public opinion of his time there took place a memorable collision. Born in an age and country abounding in individual greatness, this man has been handed down to us by those who best knew both him and the age as the most virtuous man in it. While we know him as the head and prototype of all subsequent teachers of virtue, the source equally of the lofty inspiration of Plato and the judicious utilitarianism of Aristotle, the two headsprings of ethical as well as all other philosophy, the acknowledged master of all the eminent thinkers who have since lived, whose fame still growing after more than 2,000 years, all but outweighs the whole remainder of the names which make his native city illustrious. This man was put to death by his countrymen after a judicial conviction for impiety and immorality, impiety in denying the gods recognized by the state. That is the same Socrates we examined in our lecture. And like us, John Stuart Mill concludes that the Athenians were just from their point of view in putting him to death, because legally he had outraged their laws. He turns then to Jesus and says, need we be reminded of this other figure? And yet Caiaphas, The chief priest at the Sanhedrin, Mill tells us, was absolutely convinced in his own mind that Jesus was a blasphemer. And by public opinion, by majority vote, these two greatest thinkers were legally executed. So do you see, Mill says, how feeble a criterion for judging ideas or opinions is the voice of a majority. It does not matter if only one person thinks an idea. It does not matter if everybody else thinks this idea is not only crazy, but injurious to society. We still have no right to suppress that individual. As long as that individual does not actively harm someone else, we cannot suppress him. Yes, education is an important tool, but John Stuart Mill is highly skeptical of state-supported education. It was in the 1850s that countries in Europe and the state of Massachusetts, in our own country, began to explore the idea of state-supported education. Mill said this is a bad idea. A state-supported school will have only one goal: to turn citizens into docile subjects of the state, to fill their head with all the discipline that the state requires to make them abandon their morality in the name of the state and its goals. Now, education is a good thing. Self-interest can only fulfill itself if the individual has an educated conscience. But it is for the parents of the child to see to the education. At best, what the state can do is provide opportunities. Perhaps they can provide money to families to educate the child. But that money should not be given by the state to sponsor its own schools. And so, why not have examinations that every child is required to take at a particular age, that they know the basics of reading and writing, at a later age that they know the basics of science and history and government. But all of these tests should be purely factual. John Stuart Mill, I sometimes remind my colleagues, would have preferred short answer tests, not essays, because we're not concerned with opinions, but just with their having the students learned the facts. What about laws to improve society by cutting down on evils? Well, one such evil existed in the time of John Stuart Mill. It was alcoholism. It was a powerful reforming force. The women's movement in our own country, the vote for women, ultimately goes back to involvement with the temperance movement. And in England, too, it was a great social tragedy that so many men and women were alcoholics that little children of 6 or 7 could walk into any store and get a big belt of gin. So childhood alcoholism was a serious problem. But Mill said, the state has no right to interfere by setting up laws about alcohol, because any such laws to be enforced would require a state apparatus, a governmental apparatus that would in itself become a danger to society. It could be used to oppress liberty. And hence, these kind of governmental authorities, governmental agencies, based on enforcing laws, were in themselves a threat to liberty. And so Mill concludes this statement of the absolute necessity of the individual's freedom, freedom to say and think, and as long as he doesn't hurt anyone, to do what he wishes. The worth of a state, in the long run, Mill writes, is the worth of the individuals composing it. And a state which postpones the interest of their mental expansion and elevation to a little more of an administrative skill, or of that semblance of which practice gives in the details of business, a state which dwarfs its men, in order that they may be more docile instruments in its hands, even for beneficial purposes, will find that with small men no great thing can really be accomplished, and that the perfection of machinery, to which it has sacrificed everything, will in the end avail it nothing, for want of the vital power which, in order that the machine might work more smoothly, it has preferred to banish. Every time you take a child full of ideas and intellectual curiosity, asking so many questions at the age of 5 that it is almost more than a parent can bear to answer them, and see them at the end of 12 years of compulsory school, sitting on their hands, utterly docile, asking the question, what does the teacher want on this paper? You see the wisdom of Mill's radical individualism. An admirer, but a critical admirer of John Stuart Mill, was the last of our 3 figures, Lord Acton. A little different from his peers in the liberal movement in England, Lord Acton was not only an aristocrat, but an international aristocrat. His father had been a minor nobility in England, but was Catholic, and the family had been Catholic going back generations, and for that reason the family had made its life on the continent. Catholics in those days were still restricted in many ways in England. In fact, Lord Acton himself, as a youth, could not attend Oxford or Cambridge, or at least take a degree there, because he was Catholic. His mother's side was a distinguished family of Italian and German aristocrats, and Acton himself was educated in Germany under the liberal Catholic leader Derlinger, Ignaz Derlinger. He received an education much superior to anything he would have gotten at Oxford or Cambridge, an education in serious historical studies, in the use of documents, and basing history upon the use of documents. And he came back from his studies in Munich filled with enthusiasm and vigor, setting out to bring liberalism, the ideas of science and political freedom, to the Catholic Church. Throughout his life, he was a devoted Catholic. I am not aware, he said, of ever having doubted any doctrine of the Church. But he thought that if God is all-knowing, then God must be the promulgator of scientific laws. And for the Church to resist science was to resist God. And that God believed in human freedom. And that for the Church to take its position, as it was in the mid-19th century, as the opponent of every liberal idea, was again to go against the will of God. And so he took a strong and positive voice in the debate about the Church and reforming it. He put his own career on the line in resisting the doctrine of papal infallibility. And as so often with men and women who stand up for what is right and true, he found himself largely deserted by others who were more expedient and opportunistic. And so he failed to stop papal infallibility and really ceased his productive writing career. He had become a close friend of the Liberal Prime Minister Gladstone. He was eager to see reform in England, and he supported every aspect of Gladstone's program. He was elevated to the peerage as Lord Acton, and in 1895 he became Professor of Modern History at Cambridge. He played a major role in conceiving, organizing, and bringing to fruition the Cambridge Modern History. He was regarded as the most learned man in England. For years he spoke of writing a history of liberty, but the book never came out. He published 2 lectures he had given on the history of freedom in antiquity and the history of freedom in Christianity. But to sit down and write a long, elaborate book on liberty, he could never do. His library, over 70,000 volumes, is still there in Cambridge, down in the basement of the Cambridge University Library. It still stands in its completeness and with all the little papers that he inserted, little slips of paper on which he would write ideas, and his vast collection of cards, index cards in which he wrote ideas. But as he wrote Gladstone's daughter, I simply do not have the will to write this history of freedom, because I know that even those who I think would agree with me will find what I have to say so wrong, so far from what they conceive. And what he wanted to say was that morality is the central feature of history, that we should hold up great figures to the same historical judgment that we hold up ordinary people. If Queen Elizabeth ordered the murder of Mary, Queen of Scots, then she should have been tried and executed just like a common highwayman. And even his best friends, even his old teacher, Derlinger, who kept urging him, stop doing all your research and write. Even Derlinger would have to say, you're too fiery for me. I do not understand how statesmen can be held up to the same standards as ordinary people. Surely the state has a higher morality. But you see, Acton foresaw. He foresaw the 20th century. He saw that in the infallible idea of conscience lay the real concept of liberty. He called liberty the reign of conscience, and by that he meant when every individual is free to follow the dictates of his conscience, the radical individualism of John Stuart Mill, that the individual is more important than the majority, and that the protection of minorities is the touchstone of a free nation, and morality is more important than politics, that there are absolute values, and the nation and its leaders must chart their course by these absolute standards. The state is not beyond good and evil. It must be judged by standards of enduring and absolute good and evil. Government has the duty to encourage the social and economic means necessary to make liberty viable for the masses. And he increasingly shared with Gladstone the view that the British government must make possible education, social welfare, retirement, that the welfare of the individual, his enjoyment of conscience, was dependent upon an active program of social welfare. Government, of course, must rest upon the consent of the governed. There is a duty to overthrow an immoral or unjust government. And Acton was the great admirer of the American founders. For him, not these, the American founders, were the true friends of liberty. Not Pericles, not Julius Caesar, but these American founders who risked everything for the ideal of liberty. And the great divide in the world is between the friends and enemies of liberty. It is these so-called friends of liberty who come traipsing in the garments of freedom who are the greatest dangers. Darwinism, he thought, was an enemy of liberty. Racism he condemned in every form possible. It was the most materialistic and deterministic approach to government imaginable, to say that someone should be free or not free because of the color of their skin. How evil. And yes, he also looked into the future and saw that nationalism and socialism were in no ways friends of liberty. Nationalism was another tribalistic definition, and socialism rested ultimately upon the denial of the most basic of human rights, the right to property. And he foresaw a Europe in which, under crackpot notions of nationalism and socialism, ruin would descend upon that continent, which seemed to be so eager to shed itself of its traditions of morality and liberty based upon morality. This Anglo tradition of freedom, it would find its ultimate statement in Winston Churchill. And it would find in Churchill that statesman who understood that the destiny of England had always been to defend freedom against despotism. So it had been in the time of his great ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, when England had stood against King Louis and defeated him at the Battle of Blenheim. So it had been at the time of Napoleon, when, as Churchill wrote, that storm-tossed line of battered ships alone stood against the continental tyrant Napoleon and his goal of absolute dominion. And so too he would see it as his destiny to guide England across unknown seas towards uncharted shores, guided only by the beacon light of freedom. And to Churchill, as the embodiment of this tradition of freedom, we will turn in our next lecture.